me. Do you mind if I join you? Are you sure you don't mind? You're absolutely sure I won't be disturbing you?
Hello, my name is Brenda. This is the tale of how I came to live in this new town of mine.
Hello and welcome to the Mental Suppository. I'm Brett Herholtz. My guest today is author, artist, teacher, and scriptwriter Paul Magrs. His series, The Brenda and Effie Mysteries, has recently been re-released through Snow Books, with the latest in the series, Game of Crones, released in August of 2020. His latest book, Hunky Dory, was released in December of 2020. He has done tie-in fiction as well as audio plays for the world of Doctor Who, as well as creating the character and fan favorite Iris Wildethyme. Paul, thank you for stopping by.
That's all right, thank you.
Well, when we first talked about the interview, we were going to be discussing the re-release of the Brenda and Effie series with these new gorgeous covers, as well as a new Brenda novel, Game of Crones. But now you've surprised us, and there's some you surprised us with a new novel, Hunky Dory, which came out in December, as well as some other audio surprises. Would you like to tell us a little bit about it?
Well, there's been a flurry of stuff, I guess, because I mean the odd thing is that with lockdown and the world as it is, publishing kind of stopped, and looking ahead to the future and things coming out seemed to stop. But there were things last year that were scheduled anyway and were happening. So things like the re-release of all the Brenda books have been planned for a very long time, because when things are with one publisher and then they go out to print and then a new one wants to pick them up years later, it's a very kind of quite involved process where people have to write letters to each other and release the copyright. But it has to be the agent you had at the time has to write to the publisher. So then you get an actual letter saying, so it's almost like you're in the 18th century. So it's quite complicated. It takes quite a while to sort out. And eventually we got it. And Snow Books have been brilliant in wanting to do the whole set as a uniform set. And of course they did the 6th book, which you provided the cover for back in 2012.
That's right.
Brenda and Effie Forever. And their idea was to put them all out together, plus a 7th volume, which I'd been labouring at for years and years in different ways, which became a Game of Crones, which is kind of more of a collection of stories in a way, linked stories. But then, look, I mean, the Brenda books are kind of like that anyway, in that each novel has episodes that are linked. So it's more like watching, and this was always intentional, it was always more like watching a whole season of a TV show. That's right. That's the feeling I got. Which was always a completely cynical ploy to get a TV show made out of it. Which, but it's a nice way. I do think the way people watch TV now, with streaming and stuff, is like reading a novel. And so when people talk about binge watching, what they really mean, and it's like they've rediscovered reading, because what do you call it when you sit down and you absorb as much or as little story as you want, and the story goes on and on and on, and it's no accident that the classic Netflix or Amazon series is about 10 hours. If I think about things I've liked recently, like Firefly Lane or Bridgerton, they're more or less the length of an unabridged audio book, which is interesting to me. It's like it's like through the things that we're choosing to spend our time with, they're novel length things, and it makes you think, oh my God, how did they ever adapt a novel to be 90 minutes long? And that's why you've spent your whole life going, watching a film based on a book and saying, oh yeah, but there's so much more in the book. Well, of course there is. Yeah, that's very true. A film is really tiny, and actually, 10 hours is a good solid watch of drama, isn't it? And people expect to have that much. It's like we've rediscovered the Victorian novel, isn't it? These huge, what they used to call baggy monsters of books.
Right.
I'm happy. I'm happy to spend lots of time with characters that I'm bothered about, which is why I end up writing a 7 or 8 book sequence about the same characters, because I want to spend all that time with them. And I think if the writer is happy to do that, then the reader kind of follows on with that. Hopefully, if you make it somewhere that people want to spend time.
Well, even with the new Brenda novel, you had mentioned in the introduction that there were stories that were like either published as audio somewhere else or in anthologies, and so it was really great to actually. I mean, I know the first, what was it, 3 or 4 were audio books that were recorded for Bafflegab. Am I pronouncing that right? Okay.
Yeah.
And they were great stories. I especially loved the Wool. Well, I especially loved, which was one of the non-Bafflegab, the Woolworth Horror was one of my favorite ones in the book. I found that one to be, sort of and I think that was the last story in the book. I'm not sure, but it was a great. It was one of my favorites. That one and the one with the really seedy puppeteer. I forget the name of it right now. If you.
Oh, Bat Out of Hull.
That one I really loved that one, just because it was just just that sort of really rather mean and nasty puppets character, and I thought that one was a lot of fun.
Of course, Tolstoy, the Bat, came from a novel I did years ago.
Oh, really?
In 2004, called Hands Up, about evil puppeteers.
Oh, okay.
Tolstoy the Bat is somebody who comes out of the attic, out of retirement, and goes on a kind of serial killing rampage, killing off all the puppets in showbiz. And it was published, it was a kid's book, and it was published here as Hands Up, and then it was published in the States, which amazed me. And they renamed it The Good, the Bat, and the Ugly.
Of course we did.
But it's and they tamed down some of the kind of ruder bits and some of the harsher bits. But I was still surprised that they published it, and I think it vanished without a trace, of course. But it's a book I'm very fond of, and so again, Tolstoy and his puppeteer Lurcher had to come back, and they had to come back into the world of Brenda, and that was one of these 4 audios that, as you said, Bafflegab did with Anne Reid.
That's right.
Doing Brenda, who was amazing, and all the female parts she did.
Oh, that's
And so they were meant to be hour-long things, but I think by the time she performed them, they were kind of 90-minute feature-length things. And that one, the one with Tolstoy the Bat and the puppets, won the New York Radio Awards thing that year, which was
that's wonderful,
amazing and out of the blue. So it was always in my head. I mean, that was back in 2012, I think, or 13. And my idea was to novelize those eventually, so that and so form part of the next Brenda book, and then adding other stories to it,
right?
Like the Woolworth one, and so on, till it got to a full book length thing, and because the first few Brenda books were written one a year from 2005 till 2011, and so I was doing one a year. And then I did those few stories, and there's a big gap, and I was going off and doing other things, and and some things worked out and some things didn't. I did stories about other characters, and then Brenda would suddenly appear in these other books. She appears in the background of other books, or her sister appears, or whatever. So it's funny. It really is like being haunted by characters. So it's a relief sometimes just to sit down and do a Brenda story. So when I did my book of Christmas stories for Christmas last year, it was gathering together all the Christmas tales I've done over the years, which was quite a lot, as it turned out. It was about 12 or 13.
That was the Mrs. Hudson one, right?
No.
Sorry.
In fact, I missed that out. No, over the years, every Christmas I've written a story. Christmas theme. And so the end of last year, I put together Christmassy Tales as a kind of volume just of my Christmas stories. And I thought, well, I've got to have a Brenda story in there. So I set out to write one, and it just became the longest story in the book. It became immense. And then, drew in Iris Wildethyme and Panda as characters. So it's the first crossover of those worlds, and effectively became the beginning of something bigger. Whenever the next Brenda and Effie book comes out, it's going to begin with this Christmassy tale involving the Krampus and Iris and Panda, and this business of going back to the 19th century, because I want to do some time traveling in the next Brenda book. At some point, I'll write it. It's part of it there. But yeah, Brenda by Gaslight, I think, will be my.
Oh, I love that. I love it.
So we'll see. The thing is, it's a nightmare. You say these things, I'm going to do this, and you say it in a kind of forum, and you're held to it, which is a good way of getting it done.
Right.
But it means you've made a rod for your own back.
I think that's one of the things I was going to mention. I think that's one of the things I really love about your work, is that you've sort of created this shared universe where it's like a lot of, you haven't done things where it's like there's one story where it's like, okay, I've done that in a story, I can't do it in this story. You actually bring characters or items back, like say like in Mad Dogs and Englishmen, the time cutting pinking shears make their way into a Brenda book, or you suddenly have like Iris or Carla Sorensen or Vince Cosmos showing up in other character stories. So I kind of like how you've created, I don't know if you can call it like the Mars verse or the Brenda verse. I don't know if that sounds a little too tacky, but I like it. I like how there's like, you say, like I said, you said, I can't use this in this story because it's been used in that story. You just say, you have a good idea, you use it. And, it returns.
Yeah, I mean, I think for me, it's growing up as a kid and reading Marvel and DC comics.
Yes.
There's no two ways about it. Lots of the reading pleasure in those, and people are just discovering this in the movies now, as if it's something new. The after credits scene where you get Howard the Duck making an appearance. Yes. None of this is new. It was something we assumed the universe was like. When you read those comics, the last frame would have somebody turn up. Yes. And it would be somebody from a different comic. Right. Or it would be a returning character or returning villain, or a twist that depends on knowledge that you've gained from reading something else. And even if you didn't know it at the time, what it was doing was teaching you how to be a kind of joyful reader, to know that you get these gifts, these Easter eggs, when you read. That frisson of recognition and feeling involved in a particular way is one of the great gifts of being a reader, whatever you're reading. Whether it's Victorian novels or whatever. It's looking for that recognition, knowing the codes, knowing the rules of this universe, the fictional universe that you're in, is one of the great pleasures of reading. And I do think I was trained from very early on by those comics, which required a massive amount of sophistication from 7-year-old kids to recognize these characters and to know what their powers were and when they were last seen. And if you think about those asterisks in the little boxes at the
I remember those.
And it would be the editor, but the editor would speak to you as the reader and say, remember when such and such did such and such to so and so, and then they'd say issue whatever of whatever comic, and then they'd go dash ed, and then they'd have another editor talking back to them, so you get a dialogue going between the people. Right. This kind of meta narrative going, and we took that for granted. That wasn't some kind of avant-garde, whizzy, overcomplicated, tricksy narrative device. That was just how comics worked, and we were used to it.
And even if you didn't know where the story was, what the other is saying, it's like, no, but thank you for telling me. At least, now I know I know the backstory.
And also, it sets up that business of being the kind of indefatigable collector, because what it does, it means that you go off and you look for those issues, and that's the next stage, isn't it? You end up going to second-hand places and jumble sales and all of that, and looking for back issues of things or older copies of things. So the reader becomes a kind of obsessive collector.
And what's nice over time is then they started doing like the collections of the stories. Like, you didn't have, if you missed issues, you could get the entire collection, unless you wanted the issue that feel of the grit of the old comic newsprint on your fingers as you're reading it. You know,
Yes.
the slightly tattered cover from, you know, it being much loved. And I actually can remember that because I borrowed an issue of Star Wars number 26 from my school library, and I think I borrowed that until the book itself fell apart because I just absolutely loved it. If you looked it up, it's got this great cover of like R2D2 smoldering with Luke standing over him, and it was just such a striking cover to me at that time.
And was that the Carmine Infantino era?
That was.
I know you love his work.
I like his work. For me, he's sort of the way most people, you know, love Jack Kirby's work. I always liked his work on the Flash and in Star Wars, and as well as Batman as well. He was the one who kind of gave Batman that sort of Adam West look.
When was he doing Batman?
In the 60s.
Oh, okay.
So actually, that was what inspired the Batman television show.
I didn't know that. I'm very nostalgic for the Infantino Star Wars. And for me, it's not so much having I've bought these bound volumes of things where they're perfectly printed.
Yeah.
And huge. And they're kind of too overwhelming. They're too, when you've got all the pieces of the puzzle there and they're perfect, it almost spoils it. I much prefer having the tatty individual issues of just a few. Because you never got, when you were a kid, you always missed some, or they went missing, or you lost them, or whatever. So you never had the whole story. I think one of the great fallacies is the business of being a collector who needs to have everything, because once you have everything, that's it, isn't it? It's the end of it.
It's true. It's absolutely.
In the old Arabian Nights things, when they wove carpets with those intricate patterns, they would always leave one bit empty or leave a mistake in the pattern of the carpet, because only God is perfect and man isn't, and so the pattern can't be complete. And so there's something in that, I think, that when you have these collected editions of everything, it's not always a good idea. And I do find that, I've got these kind of essential, I don't know if you have the same thing in the States, where they have like 400-page collections of...
Yes, I know what you're talking about.
And they're in black and white, which is how we got the American comics, of course, when they I don't know if you know this.
I remember seeing those in the reprints. They'd have at the back of the Star Wars reprints, the UK copies of them. It's like, and it was done, done different stories, but a lot of the times done by the same artist. And
well, we had, it was the same art, but they were always in black and white until you got to the 80s, and then they started doing color reprints. Okay. So through the 70s, they were always black and white. And
you think it was a cost thing, or?
Yeah, clearly, it was just cheap.
Fair enough.
I like it, and that's what we were used to. But these essential volumes, these kind of big bound volumes, are always black and white, and I find them a bit headachy to read because they're slightly too small as well.
Yeah.
I do prefer my old kind of yellowing comics where there's fewer pages.
I can appreciate that. Actually, I did meet Infantino at Carmine Infantino at a convention when he was still around. It was ages ago. He signed that issue that I had as a kid, that I enjoyed as a kid. It was a very brief one. He was a bit grumpy, and I think he was, he's getting a bit on. So it was one of those things. I just, quickly asked him, could you please sign this? And he just signed it quickly, and I thanked him and walked off. So went back to my table.
Well, it's a souvenir, isn't it? You're not going to have the kind of big conversation. I mean, I do think those Comic-Con things and all those conventions, and we've been at those things together and seen how they work. And I do think they're tiring for people taking part, especially for the older artists and writers and actors.
Right. And
they get worked off their feet. And I'm always dubious about these things where people are queuing to spend loads of money to have photos taken. And there's no chance for people to have conversations. It's just whisking them in, and it's a bit of a factory, isn't it?
Yes.
It's a different kind of convention to what I'd kind of prefer to go to, really.
And I just, especially, you said, tiring for a lot of the older people attending, or the older people that are the guests, but also, especially if you're traveling from abroad, that's, you just get off a flight, and it's a hell of a flight, I'm sure, because you got the time change, and now on top of that, you're being paraded out, and I just
Well, I mean,
I can
from my point of view, when I did a few of those things, and
Yeah.
it was all delightful.
right.
It was easy as anything, and we just had a really good laugh, and it was all fun.
It
But
really, yeah,
I wasn't there sitting for God knows how many hours signing stuff and having
Right.
photos. And when you go as a writer, you're having a lovely time. I'd sit in the bar with people I wanted to be talking to, and
Right.
so when you're signing things and talking, I mean that's the thing I want to be at. When you can sit, if it's somebody you like Carmine Infantino, you can sit and chat and get things
Right.
signed and have that kind of proper conversation about stuff, which
Yeah.
mostly these things aren't like that. You don't get that chance. And I was in a lucky position as a kind of guest who was a writer that nobody wanted their photo taken with, and was a writer.
Oh, a few people did actually. A few.
No, but I'm not there with a queue of people dressed up
No.
and thank God. It's
would be unique.
you're in a very lucky position that you can sit and have conversations.
Right.
That's what I like doing, and meeting new people and seeing what they're talking about.
A glass of Merlot with K9, a hamburger with Davros.
Well, we did all those things, didn't
Yeah,
we?
it was amazing. It was just
absolutely hysterical, wasn't it?
It's just like you're sitting next to this person, you realize you've seen them on the television. It's I don't want to say it's surreal. It's just really unique.
But I mean, whenever I did that, and those people were there at our table because they weren't doing that number. They were there because they were interested in everybody else there, and
Right,
those
absolutely.
people that I'm interested in. Amongst those kind of actors and things,
Yeah.
who want to talk about, find out what you're doing there, and
Yeah.
what you.
Absolutely.
So that's a big part of it. And I've missed those dues.
Oh, me too. But
Yeah, although I mean, it did seem as if there were fewer Doctor Who conventions in the States before the pandemic. Anyway, I think
Yeah.
things had slowed down the last few years.
it seemed like the only couple I recall would be like the one out in Los Angeles and the one in Chicago, with the only
Ones
two
that
I
have been
can think
forever.
of. Yeah, exactly.
Do you think Doctor Who's the current Doctor Who's lost its popularity then in the States in the
I'm
last
not
few
entirely
years?
sure. I just it's hard to read people,
Yeah.
because I mean I know a lot of people who still absolutely love it's kind of like the new Star Wars. There are people that kind of stand by it, and then there are people that think it's lost its charm and it's ruined, which I don't agree with. And
I think, I mean, it's just a bizarre time, isn't it? Where who'd have thought we'd be having new Doctor Who, new Star Wars, and new Star Trek, and multiple
It's very
shows.
true.
multiple- It just seems impossible. And although I've kind of, at various points, I've parted company with different versions of those things.
Right.
I like Discovery. I just thought by the end of the third season, no, it's not for me anymore. And similarly with the Star Wars films, but then love The Mandalorian, because
Yes.
these things become multifarious. And I think, and there's different strands to them. I think, again, because the people making them are harking back to what comics did in the 70s.
That very true. Yep.
I mean, it's what Marvel Comics themselves are doing in films and TV, isn't it? There's lots of strands and crossover. Now everything's copying that.
Yeah.
It means that there's always going to be a bit that you don't like, but there'll be another bit that you get on with.
Exactly. It's like Doctor Who. There's an area you'll like. There's an area you won't like as much.
Although I do wish, Russell T Davies said recently in the press, didn't he, that the BBC should be making Doctor Who in the same way that they make Star Trek and Star Wars, that there should be different branches of Doctor Who in production all the time, different spin-offs, and
I'd like that.
it would be amazing, wouldn't it?
Yeah.
And he said he would sit down tomorrow and have a 10-part series with Matt and David as the 10th and 11th Doctors teaming up for 10 weeks. And
As long as you're the writer writing it, I'll watch it.
Yes.
As long as you're one of the writers. I mean, there's.
Who me?
Yeah, you.
People ask me, but if Russell said he wanted to do it, they'd do it, and I think they should have that. I think that would be amazing.
I mean, everybody kind of wanted a Paul McGann series after that Night of the Doctor came out, and I think they really should have, because it would have been nice to see, the direct, see how he got to where he was going to,
And I saw somebody say, somebody in the industry saying, how could they have. I mean, the reaction to that short that they made was massive, and they got some kind of ridiculous figures for the BBC website. Like, if that had been in the States, of course there would have been a show follow-on from that. You just any sign of people gravitating to something, you capitalize on it, you create something further from it. But I don't know why they don't. It's the idea that they will confuse the audience,
right?
Having two different doctors running about, but I think that's not true. I think the way that look at the way superhero things have gone, where there's different universes and different versions of the same character,
right?
And I think we have the general audience is so kind of au fait with the conventions of science fiction, and the fact that continuity is so complex, and you don't have to. I mean, it'd at least be an embarrassment about it that you couldn't have continuity references going back so far, because that in the 80s it's what popularly that's what they thought killed Doctor Who, wasn't it? Because it relied on talking to its fan audience. But I think in this day and age, everybody's fans,
right,
of something or other, because we watch TV in a different way. We watch it in this kind of slightly obsessive way, and the pandemic has certainly made fans of all of us.
Oh, absolutely. But we discussed that a while ago, the whole thing of continuity, and because it's like I realized that because when you were talking about, like, I think Nest Cottage, you had wanted that, you had this whole idea, and it was a way I actually thought as a kid when watching Doctor Who is like, yes, that doctor sort of regenerates, but then he kind of gets up and walks, just kind of walks away and goes on his own adventures. And so, just having it, that idea, and I just thought to myself, I felt like I lost some of that, getting sort of obsessed with that whole continuity thing. I, sort of lost that little bit of my childhood where it's like the idea that all these different incarnations of the Doctors are still out there, still having new adventures. So
and getting older, they're kind of like ghost versions of themselves. I love that
exactly
idea.
No, that would be fantastic.
And I think that the series itself has kind of acknowledged that. I mean, I still can't believe that they did an episode at the end of a season last year, right before lockdown, right before the world locked down.
Oh, I know.
The whole episode, the whole season built to something that hinged on that moment in the brain of Morbius to do with doctors previous to Hartnell. Just, it's outrageous that anybody would think of doing that.
And that really split people too. I mean, I didn't feel either way about it. I just felt like, it's like with any series, the next producer could end up changing everything and saying, no, I want to. Exactly. So that doesn't bother me.
It's a brilliant and bold thing to do.
Oh, yes.
I don't think there was much of a story to it. I think the whole was the Doctor tied up while the Master did a TED talk. And
it's true.
And nothing happened. There was no.
Hi, Bernard.
Sucky, come on.
Aw.
Hello. He did this last night during my reading.
Did he?
Yeah. I got so far in, and he shouted and sat on the desk and looked down the camera at everyone. Come on. Come and say hello to Brett.
Oh. Hello, Bernard.
Look, in there. Can you see? He doesn't recognize screen stuff. If he hears a cat on a screen, he'll look, but he doesn't recognize the pictures moving as being anything real. Do you? No, so it seems that all those shows are moving into the idea of multiverses. And stuff that we've had in novels for such a long time. And
oh yes, I mean there was the whole Crisis on Infinite Earths with DC that was like insane. That just, which is funny because when they did the television adaptation of it, they actually had the writer Marv Wolfman on it, who has Supergirl and the Flash, sign an autograph from him. And these were two characters he killed in the original Crisis comic. And he actually said, he goes, I missed my chance, but I wanted to kind of whisper in their ears. He goes, I'm sorry I killed you.
It's great though, isn't it? That it's almost like the time has arrived for all that stuff that was, slightly geeky in the past.
Yeah.
I hate that word geeky though. I still can't believe that Doctor Who episode hinged upon the clip from the brain of Morbius, which they showed as part of the thing to tell us. Just unbelievable how
And that has
ridiculous.
been the debate for years. If, that was like Morbius's incarnations as the Doctor's blah, blah, blah. But that was also at a time where they, Doctor Who's always been kind of a work in progress.
Yes,
It's always
that's
been,
true.
they didn't really start having like I don't want to say a set, history of Doctor Who till like The Deadly Assassin. But even that, they were still
Yeah,
sort
they
of
started
creating
nailing it
ideas
down
over.
then, didn't they? But that was just for the purposes of that story, and
Exactly.
Robert Holmes wouldn't have been precious about it. But it was in the 80s when they started having a Bible, and that's always kind of a mistake. I think that's. I mean, it's interesting with Discovery, isn't it? Because they set off by setting it in a very particular time,
Yes.
and then you think, oh, it's going to be new. Why can't they just set it in a time when we don't know anything?
Sort of like
And
what they did with
they
Next
almost say,
Generation, right?
yeah, and yes, where they had a completely free canvas, and you think that they kind of thought that themselves with Discovery, that they'd written themselves into a corner, so they shot them forward 1,000 years or whatever for season 3, and so that it's all taking place in a place we've never seen before, and you think, well, that's what Star Trek has to be in.
Right.
I do think Doctor Who has to be in a place that we know. That the thing about Doctor Who is kind of familiarity, so that even if you're going to another planet, it's about something that we can relate to on Earth, or a time that we know from something else, from a different kind of drama or a novel or whatever. I think Doctor Who's very much in the world of, in the business of pastiching things.
Right.
It's best when we do that. Here's the Doctor arriving in, it's Jane Austen's time, and this happens and this happens, and then we bring in a monster, and it's the collision of two worlds that we know from elsewhere. That's what
right.
Doctor Who's about. I think that's when it works best.
Or sort of like bringing in Edgar Allan Poe and like having Cthulhu be in the story for whatever reason.
Yeah. Except it would be better if it was, because I can imagine Cthulhu being an Edgar Allan Poe thing anyway, and it not being too much of a jarring contrast.
That's
Doctor
true.
Who
Yeah.
with really good contrast. So if you had
Right.
an Edith Wharton novel and the world of Edith Wharton from, and then Cthulhu's in that kind of 1890s.
I could see that.
High society and all of that, and then Cthulhu. That the contrast is much sharper.
Right.
And it's more imaginative. It's that how do these things coexist? How do they, and so these ladies in the big gowns and things swanning about in, Belle Epoque New York with tentacles underneath their gowns as they go to the opera. That to me is much more.
I'd so watch that.
Yeah, so I mean, you expect Edgar Allan Poe to be creepy and about monsters from elsewhere. So I think that kind of strange, funny juxtaposition. I think at its heart, Doctor Who has to be amusing.
Well, I think people call it science fiction, but Doctor Who's done so much more than just science fiction. You've had like the historicals. You've had stories that were mystery stories. You've had monster stories. I mean, a good point is like when you wrote the Peterloo Massacre, you did a solely a historical that had a lot of like a lot of emotion and a lot of heart in it, and it didn't really have any real villains, but really kind of did. It had people that were bad people, but it didn't have like an overarching super villain in it, and I think that's how the story, and that's why the story worked really well.
Yeah, and I think there has to be room for that kind of story within Doctor Who. I think that they have to be a good story, and
Absolutely.
And generally it's the genre is mystery story. Even if it's got no science fiction elements, it can still be a kind of mystery adventure story where they put all the pieces together and realize what's at stake and what they've got to sort out. So I think it's a bit of a misnomer sometimes when people talk about Doctor Who's science fiction, and then other times it's this kind of genre. And I think underneath all of that is the shape of the basic story, which is mystery adventure, which is a very old-fashioned kind of Edwardian, Victorian kind of genre, isn't it? It goes back to H.G. Wells or Sherlock Holmes,
absolutely,
or Professor Challenger. And sometimes those things involve scientific elements. Sometimes they just didn't.
Right.
They were murders, or they were mystery. They were mysteries. They were puzzles. And I think that's what Doctor Who mostly is, because that's the characters he's mostly like.
Well, going back to the timeless child, here's a thought. What if the timeless child isn't the Doctor? What if the Master lied and it was Susan?
Or it was the Master. I thought that would be a
Oh,
lovely twist to have
yeah,
the Doctor suddenly go, no, it's not. You know, you've been jealous all these years. It wasn't me. It was you, which would fit more in with the Master's sense of never being, you know, having his nose pushed out on
right,
Gallifrey, never
absolutely.
looking in,
And it would
looking
just
into
probably drive him nuts.
looking into the untempered schism and going,
Exactly.
and there's a reason for that, because he came from elsewhere. He's the cuckoo in the nest. Makes much
Exactly.
more sense at a character level, I think, than what we did. But I don't think they're thinking. I think they're thinking of effects that they can have,
Yes,
of twists they can do, but they're not thinking about story.
exactly.
And
Substance.
that disturbs me slightly. So when you had that whole episode where it went into Ireland, it kind of made no sense at a story level.
Right.
I still don't understand what that was about. So
Mm.
that just, it's that awful thing of being jumped out of enjoying it and watching it and starting to think as a writer.
Right.
Where have they gone wrong? Why is the story skipped a groove like a record going round? It's like you've noticed a scratch in the record, and sometimes
Yeah.
you do that in stories. It's like, that's, oh no, if they've just gone back this way. if this was a, you know, a dream that's I mean, I had this whole, you know, you do it all the time, don't you? Have theories about what's going on, and
Right.
if it had been oh, it doesn't matter, but I had this whole thing, I'm not going to explain it now, it sounds stupid. But yes, you know, you're expecting it to go one way, and then the way it goes isn't as good as the one in your head. Now, as a comics reader, you must know that
Oh, yes.
that when the month goes by between those issues, and oh no, they've done that, and it's finished.
Yes. No, I know exactly what you're talking. Yeah, I've read past issues where it's like, or they change an artist and it just doesn't have that
Oh yeah,
same
that's
feel to it, and it's just like, not that the artist they chosen is particularly bad, but it kind of, like you said, skips a groove in the record.
Yeah, yes, and that would, and often that would happen. It's not always true. Thinking back, it was when the publisher or the people in charge had lost interest in the comics, so the personnel were changing around, and
Right.
and you found that with things like Star Wars, actually, as it went on, it was like, oh, that's, or Star Trek, when DC were doing Star Trek in the 80s.
I vaguely remember that.
Oh, and it was between the movies, and so after they killed off Spock, and Sarvik joins the crew, and you get this whole other world, and it was written and drawn by the same people for a couple of years. It was very,
Yeah.
very, very consistent, and you believed it completely. This world
Right.
without Spock, and but then they started messing about with who was drawing and who was writing,
Oh,
and
yeah.
you just fall between the gaps as a reader. It's like it's not the same world anymore. Secret Wars. Remember Secret Wars in the 80s?
I do. As a kid, I wanted those action figures because they had those shields on it with the. I was at that age where it's like, you know, when you see the toy commercials, you'd sort of immediately gravitate between that one and like the Superpower collection, which was like the DC one with like Batman and Superman would have like these action moves, and they were like around. They were around the size of like Star Wars figures, maybe a little bit bigger.
Yeah, we didn't get them. We'd had the fist fighters, as they were called in the 70s, that were Mego, I think they were called.
Mego, yes.
In the States, and somebody just sent me a beautiful advert saying this is just like something you would write, and it was when the same company did the Wizard of Oz as toys about this big, and so the advert was the yellow
I saw
brick road.
those. Yeah.
But they're on the yellow brick road with all the Planet of the Apes characters, all of the Marvel superheroes going down the yellow brick road, and all the Universal monsters, because you could get all of them as these figures, and DC as well, I think. And it is like, yeah, exactly. That is exactly my world. All of the characters from everything going down the yellow brick road. I can't think of anything nicer.
I think
And
the older
Star
I've,
Trek people as well.
I think the older I've gotten, it's like I've loved the more 60s and 70s DC and Marvel stories more than when they sort of got later, darker and grittier.
Yeah, exactly. And to me, it's like, you know, that people are welcome to that stuff, and they're welcome the movies, which don't always chime with me. And I know that my stuff is the Bronze Age, it's the 60s, but it's mostly the 70s. And it stops, I think, with Secret Wars 2.
Yeah.
That's it. That's when, but then that's all right. You know, I read comics from being 5 until I was 15. That's kind of proper, isn't it?
I think so, unless you're one of these people who kind of ends up deciding to go to college to study this sort of stuff. Or
yeah, but it's just another form of narrative. But what I
but
mean
even
is that
then,
people read everything obsessively all the
Right.
time with the same kind of fervor, and I just can't. You know, it was like that's that. Although if they brought back Amazing Man tomorrow, I'd be there.
oh yeah, actually, I was just
Yeah,
watching a series, Batman: The Brave and the Bold, which was I think you'd really enjoy the series because it's very
No, I know.
it's very Silver Age Batman, but they had Amazing Man on it.
Which episode is Amazing Man in? Because Amazing Man is really. I mean, this is a deep dive. Nobody else knows Amazing Man.
I'll have to look it up because they also had Batmite on an episode, and they had him played by.
Batmite.
That was hysterical because Paul Rubens, aka Pee Wee Herman, made a great Batmite.
Did you ever read Amazing Man at the time?
I think that was one I missed, unfortunately.
Because it didn't run for very long and nobody bought it. Because it was so eccentric, and it was about it's just about people and about this funny little fella who thinks he's a superhero who's dug the stuff out of a bin.
That sort of reminds me of like there was this Golden Age character called the Red Tornado, who was actually some woman who is like the kid's maid who dresses up as a superhero, and she wears long johns and has like a tin pot over her head and fights with a mop. I mean, it's like the only type of stories you'd expect out of like the 1940s. You know, that sort of very silly, very not sort of like the old Captain Marvel's, aka Shazam comics that I absolutely loved because they weren't completely serious. They sort of dealt with magic, and they dealt with more cartoony sort of characters, and it just very lighthearted stories.
I like the ones where they're based more in the place as well. And Amazing Man was in Queens.
Oh,
you got a sense of the neighborhood and all the neighbors and who lived where and what they all did all day. And so I loved that when you got glimpses of that in the Fantastic Four, The Thing, and Yancey Street, and as somebody living in the northeast of England,
yes,
to get this sense of an America that was about real places that was sometimes down at heel. They weren't these kind of shining skyscrapers everywhere. That was the image we had of America and American comics. I
think that's why that's another thing I've loved about your work and your books is having a lot of it based in Manchester and based around places and stuff you know about. I just sort of had that glimpse into that side of the world I'm not familiar with. So I think that's one of the things I've loved about your work.
Sense of place is really important, I think. And so when I go places, I like to kind of sink into it to get a good sense of a new place from from the ground up, and to kind of sink into it and get a feel of where I am, and that's really important. And one of the things, I'm not a great traveller necessarily, but I have missed being out in places this year, just kind of sucking up that kind of detail.
Yeah,
that kind of grainy detail of places.
Yeah. And I think that's always been something that's kind of that always kind of puzzled me when you mentioned past publishers saying that you shouldn't have your stories so local, because I think that's one of the genuinely nice things about stories is having them having a sense of a place you've never been, introducing your audience. No,
it's a different thing in the States to the UK, though, in that people in kind of British publishing tend to think that everything should be in London and set in London and and not in the North. Or if it's the North, it's a particular kind of cliched North that they've got in their heads. I think in America, there's the idea of regionalism is much more respectable, that people expect each part of the states to have its own kind of literature, its own atmosphere, its own local colour, and so there's nothing. It's far less snobby, I think. Things aren't inferior for not being set in one of the capital cities in the States.
it does tend to, you will have stories that tend to sort of gravitate more towards New York or towards Boston. Whereas, when I'm doing something, I like, having it set in, like say Worcester, Massachusetts, which has been considered, Boston's sort of ugly twin sister, and which I don't necessarily see, but it's also, it's one of those things. It's an area, I've kind of gone around places I've known, streets I've seen, like the sort of interesting little areas that, I've gone to, sort of like a place called the Vernon, which used to be a speakeasy, but which had a place downstairs that used to be a speakeasy back in the 20s.
Oh, is that where you filmed? Is that where you made the film?
Yeah, it was.
Yeah.
And it's still down there. It's just not in the shape that it probably was back in like the early part of the 20th century. But like I said, that's why I've enjoyed your books, just learning about Levisham and learning about Manchester.
I think people in the States, though, are interested in where people come from. I mean, one of the things that always fascinates me about Americans is that they tell you where they've come from and where their people have come from and what they're related to and what they're made up out of and what their experience of living in a place was like and how it's made them.
Yeah.
But in Britain, people are taught to be ashamed of a lot of that. It's class. It's class. So being northern working class is something that if you start talking about it, means that other people are pigeonholing you straight away and seeing your limitations. That's not my experience of the way that Americans talk. Maybe I've got a kind of rose-tinted view of the way America is. I think people are very proud of what makes them up and how kind of multifarious that is.
Right.
And they're proud of the kind of the odd, slightly obscure or idiosyncratic makeup of their individual pasts.
Right.
Here, less so. People who write novels went to Oxford and Cambridge and come from the South and write about London, generally, which is so dull. There's loads of people who do that.
It's true.
There's been loads of people that do that.
There are other parts of the country to be written about.
Yeah, and so I'm happy to write about other regions, but also to find out about other regions and have other places to explore. And after we can get out again, I'll be looking forward to finding new places.
Absolutely.
To explore and write about.
Speaking about happy surprises, you released a new book in December, Hunky Dory.
Yeah. That's one that's been waiting for its moment. It's very much a book set in South Manchester, in the present.
And it's got a character you first mentioned at the last convention we went to,
Really?
Dodie Golightly. You were just developing her at the time.
Yeah, I mean, it's a name I've used twice. So I think the iteration of Dodie that I was talking to you about was more the kind of detective Dodie.
Right, that was it.
Who appears in a different story that I did called Mystery Lady, set in the 1960s, in the same place. So she might be related. She might be,
A niece.
Well, she might be So the current Dodie might be a niece of this 1960s Dodie. That's how I think about it in my head. And she's a lot less stylish than the 1960s Dodie.
Right.
So this is a book with no genre stuff, no kind of monsters or aliens or ghosts at all. I don't think, but it's a kind of ensemble piece, a kind of comic piece about people here in Levenshulme in the south of Manchester. Lots of queer characters, lots of argumentative characters, families interacting, much more like the kind of earlier books that I first put out.
They were characters that felt very, very real. They felt like people that I possibly met, people I know, people that I could sort of, empathize with as well. I mean, I thought it was really interesting. You chose the age 35 as Dodie's age in the book, because I feel like it was like 30. I felt like 35 was at a time in my life was a very important age.
Yeah, it's interesting because they, of course, publishers want characters to be young, and
right.
Young feisty heroines of 21 or whatever, and it's she's 35 and she's a bit tired. She's a bit beaten by life already, and she's living back with her mother.
Yes,
and she's a bit worn out, and she's not feisty, and she's not perky, and that's that's not the kind of person a book should be about, apparently.
But she's a
And I
very
think-
likable, very relatable character.
but they've got people tend to have this fixed idea of what a lead character should be, and she should be pushing the plot along. And I think no, she's more of a kind of victim of circumstance a lot of the time. She's following people and ligging onto them. At least she begins that way. I think she learns a lot. But it just, people who are slightly battered by life interest me more than very young people who have a feist. I hate that word feisty. I think it's such a lie. I don't believe in feistiness as a characteristic. It's like when people, do you have the same word in the States? Do people describe somebody who's effervescent in their personality as bubbly?
A little bit, yeah.
It's everywhere here. And it's like there can't be a better description of a person. It's like that's the best thing you could be. So if somebody's killed, if there's a murder, and then they talk to their relatives and friends on the news, they say, well, what was she like? Well, she was lovely. She was bubbly. Not that she was, kind and gentle and looked after people and
a good person.
Bubbly. Yeah, she was bubbly. So it made me think for a long time, what on earth, what kind of virtues are we seeking out in
Is she a soda?
To make to make them that awful word relatable. That's the word that
yes.
Why do we care about them? And the TV news in this country and the popular media seem to think that bubbliness is the thing that's closest to godliness in our current era. The thing that we most approve of is, because you never hear, if somebody say, oh, well, this serial killer died, and then they say, he lived on your street. What was the serial killer like? Oh, he was bubbly.
Yeah.
You never hear that, do you?
He was bubbly. You never expected him to do what he did, keeping somebody in the fridge.
Yes. So that's how you tell what kind of, that's the test. What do they say about the victim? What do they say about the murderer? And that's how you learn what adjectives society is placing great value on. What do people need to be good? And so, bubbly is the thing these days. And I can't stand bubbliness. It's like people being feisty. I think it's nonsense. Yeah. I think it's a kind of patronizing and probably slightly sexist term. About telling us what women should be behaving like. And they're either feisty or bubbly. And it makes them sound stupid.
Exactly. Yeah. It just seems very outdated.
Yeah. And I think for all that people go around pretending that we're so progressive in so many ways, generally, the way people carry on isn't very progressive at all.
I was actually very careful not to introduce you as like a sci-fi or mystery or
that's very kind of you.
Or horror author, because I was actually talking to another author about it, and I just feel like it seems like with a lot of authors, they may or may not want to just write in one genre, but it seems like a lot, you see a lot of like authors out there that tend to be pigeonholed into that one genre, and I didn't know if it was one of these things that, was it like fans that preferred to read that author's particular work, or was it one of these things? Is it the publisher?
Yeah, it's always a marketing tool, and I always feel I didn't used to mind, but I've got lots of thoughts about this actually over the years. When I did this library reading online this week for LGBTQ History Month, and so the library's got me to do the reading, I was described in their publicity as fantasy and science fiction writer, which just seems not right to me. It doesn't fit me at all. Just writer's good enough, thanks.
Yeah, author.
And that's. I mean, I remember Patrick Gale, the novelist, years and years ago when I first knew him in the 90s, and he said that he'd seen some publicity material about his next novel coming out, and where the marketing people had filled out the form describing his work. They just said, what genre? Gay. What audience? Gay. And so immediately his audience is limited to this tiny.
Yeah.
That's not what he's a gay writer, but it doesn't mean that he's. And equally, I think you might have written some science fiction. It doesn't make you a science fiction writer per se. And certainly turning up at science fiction conventions or turning up at anything where there's lots of proper science fiction writers, I feel very embarrassed because that's not what I do. I do something else. I think I write comic fiction that that probably connects most of what I do. But then I've written wartime saga novels recently, which have no genre stuff in it all. I do stuff under different names. I'd love to have a different name and a different persona for every genre going. That would make me as happy as really commercial ones as well. I just drop myself into different genres with no irony whatsoever. No.
Edward Gorey used to do that. He used to make up anagrams for his own name, and give himself these like like the Aldred Weary. I think he called himself once in a book Edward Pig.
Did he? Did he write the books though and publish them?
I think a lot of them were like his illustrations. Some of them I think there were a few that were like adaptations of other people's books, like the Hilaire Belloc books. Like he did the illustrations for. But he did do they were the ones that I think he just did it as a lot of it as a lark, just to just as like the Audrey Gore legacy was one of them. He did like the setting up for the detective novels, and he created like the ultimate like a detective character who has like one leg and one hand and missing an eye.
He's wonderful. I read and I forget who wrote it, the massive biography that came out the year before last.
Oh, I haven't had a chance to read that yet. I'm looking forward to that.
The whole of Christmas last year, year before last. I'll just find out. It's Mark Deary.
Oh, okay.
And it's really worth reading.
I'll have to check that out, because there's another one a friend gave me called The Strange Case of Edward Gorey.
Oh yeah,
I still need to read. Yeah.
That came out about 20 years ago, and I got it when we first moved to Manchester.
Oh, okay.
So I've got a lovely hardcover edition of it now. But when it came out as a comic. With,
really?
But with text. I think this is right. Text in the Gorey font, in columns, like it was newsprint, and then all kinds of illustrations. And eventually they printed a fancy hardback. But it's really beautifully written. Yeah.
Well, there's supposed to be a documentary coming out about him.
Is there?
Yeah, it's been in the works for years, but the guy who was producing it started when he was very, very young, and he did some interviews with
the clips.
Yeah, he did these interviews with Gorey, and it was just the poor kid he was just I think either a high school or college kid who was doing this doing this just as because he loved the great man, and Gorey would just give these great little talks, and one of them, much like Socks walking over your table, he had one of his cats kind of walking in front of him, or
what cats will do. But
exactly.
Of course, Gorey's in my head the whole time I'm doing these cartoons with Panda and the cat and the dreadful.
Oh, I've loved those. Those have been hysterical.
He's there in my head as somebody that you can't do better than. What a career, what a ridiculous thing to set out to do. And when I started putting a book together that was just cartoons and drawings, I thought, why did I ever write novels? Because you do a cartoon and people either laugh or they don't laugh.
Yeah, they either get it or they don't. I've found that.
But it's immediate, and you can see it in their faces. And you can't do that with fiction. You could give them a book, and then they're like, "Oh, great." That's people's reaction. You give them a book. I've written this. It's the most important thing. It's taken 7 years. Here's your copy that I'm giving you. And you look in their eyes, and they're like, "Oh, great! How thick's that?" And that's people who like reading, and that's people who might like you. And even then, it's like, oh God, thanks, because then they've got to go off and sit for hours and hours and hours. And it's like, well, yeah, think about what it was like for me. I had to sit even longer to write the thing.
Exactly.
But sometimes they come back and they're nice. But as a novelist, you never get that immediacy, which is why I think, apart from money and fame, novelists always want to see their books filmed as TV or film, so then they can watch it with those nearest and dearest, or their friends, or even people they hate, look sideways and see the reaction, because you never get it. Artists get it all the time. Musicians get it all the time. They get an audience. You give readings sometimes, but that's very polite, isn't it? People go, ha ha ha, and that's if you're lucky. But they're not pissing themselves laughing. They're not rolling about generally. as they would do with a film or just giving them a cartoon. So I think that immediacy is what attracts me to it. But then, being a cartoonist was the first thing I ever did.
Oh, really?
Well, yeah, I mean, that's what I always wanted to be, being a kid and just drawing cartoons all the time. And of course, you get trained out of it. You get told by everyone, well, that's not something that people do for a living. And I wish I could go back in time and say, of course it is.
Yeah, exactly.
Of course people do. But that's a class thing as well.
We will continue with part 2 of my interview with Paul Magrs next week. Until then, thank you for listening to The Mental Suppository. And this is Brett Herholtz saying,
I knew I'd disturb you.
The Mental Suppository has been produced by Brett Herholtz and Jamie Billings and distributed by M the Media Project. Theme music generously donated by Mr. B, the Gentleman Rhymer. Visit his webpage at gentlemanrhymer.com. We would love to hear from our fans. Email us at mentalsuppository@gmail.com.